This is a singular honor for me tonight. I want to first say how humbled I am by this whole event. We've stayed here before. I'm well aware of the tradition that this club represents. The halls are filled with memories of great warriors and veterans that we all know and admire. There are a few people in the audience who pulled a few fast ones on me tonight. My family has shown up from all points of the globe. My grandson Owen, one of my champions, is here. Came from Connecticut. Two of my sons, Martin and Mark, drove in from God knows where, and Joanne. This is all a total surprise to me. I had no idea they were going to be here. In any event, I want to talk to you about our experiences in Vietnam, but my approach is just a little bit different. I'm not a warrior. I certainly don't qualify as a historian as Jan Herman does, and know very little about the geopolitical circumstances that lead to wars or end wars. I'm a physician, a surgeon, and for a brief period of time, with Ed Feldman, Joe Wolfe, and others, in one of the most remarkable situations the surgeon could ever be in, and that is the Siege of Khe Sanh. As Colonel McCarthy mentioned, for a 3-month period in early 1968, while we were surrounded by, whether it was 25 or 40,000 NVA troops, we'll never know for sure, and under constant bombardment, that team and those 26 corpsmen provided casualty care for 2,500 wounded Marines. It is a remarkable moment in time for me, I'm sure for some of you, and it has always been a watershed moment in my life. So the book is not about war per se or military tactics or any geopolitical considerations. It's an attempt to convey to you that the real story of war, from my point of view, are the 58,000 names on that wall in Washington and the 300,000 casualties that took place during that conflict. I try to bring focus to the fact that war is a constant part of history. You all know more about that than I do. But there's very little of the 12,000 books and articles that have been written about Vietnam. There's very little about the actual medical, surgical component of those conflicts. And that's what I want to try to talk to you about tonight. Let me see if I can just get this little clicker to work here. The first thing I wanted to show you is a little bit of the geography of Vietnam so you can get some idea of what we're talking about. If you look at the map here, this whole area is Vietnam. This, of course, is North Vietnam. Saigon is way down here, but way up in here, the red line here is the DMZ, and Khe Sanh, of course, is right here. So we were the whole time in the very northernmost portion of South Vietnam, which was called I Corps by the Marine Corps. And I mention that because of all the stories you'll hear about Vietnam, and there are many, many different versions of it, so much is related to where you were. Just a brief aside, when I came back from Vietnam, I returned to the Department of Surgery at the University of Pennsylvania. A fellow there, a friend of mine, Ira Charlip, had been in Vietnam with the United States Army just outside of Saigon. So he was way down here. The two of us were invited to the Women's Club of the University of Pennsylvania to describe our experiences in Vietnam. And of course, I told stories of casualty care in I Corps, and Ira was a medical officer with an Army unit in the South that had not much combat experience, but a lot of sick call and so forth. But the key point was, one of the ladies in the audience said, "Could you tell me about drug use amongst the troops?" And I said, well, the only thing I can tell you is that in the entire year that I was up in that I Corps area, there was one occasion when a Marine came in. Now, let me digress and tell you that when the casualty load came in, we put them all in litters, and everyone was stripped naked. And the reason for that was you didn't want to miss a minor shrapnel wound at the base of the skull or in the armpit or up near the rectum, which could easily be missed without careful inspection. And then we had a little canvas bag, a ditty bag. We put all their possessions in that. one time in 12 months. I heard this big commotion over at one of the litters I went over. They found a funny looking little cigarette in the pocket of one of the Marines. One little cigarette in 12 months. So I said to the ladies, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, I was with the Marines for 12 months and I saw no evidence whatsoever of drug use. Ira gets up and says, everybody I know was stoned for 12 months. So my point is, an awful lot of the stories in Vietnam have to be taken on a geographic basis because everybody, it's like the three blind men feeling the elephant and describing it as three totally different animals, okay? So bear that in mind as we look at that. Let me see if I can make this work. All right. The other point I want to make in differentiating Vietnam from other wars, and again, I emphasize I'm certainly no authority on the other wars. If you look at the histories from World War II and even Korea, the one theme that runs through them is the concept of a front line. Whether it was fighting through Europe or fighting up and down the Korean Peninsula, usually the stories of the battles were identified with some sort of a front line. No such line ever existed in Vietnam. This slide shows where the battles broke out simultaneously. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back. I did everything wrong. Somebody help me. Anyway, well, if you can fix that, the point is that simultaneously in early 1968, dozens and dozens of battles broke out at the same time all over the country. And this was another key point in differentiating our experience from that recorded in the other wars. We were never anywhere where we could say they're here and we're there. We were very frequently in one enclave surrounded by them or another enclave, another unit surrounded. And that made a great tactical difference in terms of the medical and surgical care of the casualties. Are we back online? All right. So all these little bursts indicate the battles that broke out simultaneously in January and February of 1968. So I make the point that regardless of what surgical unit you were attached to, there's no front line, okay? Now, I want to talk about the differences between the wars, again, in terms of casualties. This brief summary shows the number of casualties from the different wars. As you can see, Vietnam comes in third with 58,000 dead and 300,000 wounded. And in terms of the ranking of the wars, it's in fourth place in all of the major wars that we fought in the last century. So quite a number of casualties. This just gives you a brief idea of the injuries that we saw just based on body distribution. This is kind of a standard slide, but this pretty much represents exactly what we did see. This also emphasizes the need for the naked casualty, and I can't emphasize that enough. I can't tell you how often we've had injured Marines come in lying on a litter looking as though there's no visible injury, and then on careful inspection find the wound in the back, the wound in the axilla, the wound in the groin that is not seen unless you have a totally naked person inspected in 360 degrees. Let me just move on here. Before we get to some discussion of the specifics of Khe Sanh, let me just tell you a little bit about some of the statistics concerning the people who served in Vietnam. Some of this comes from General Mike Myatt, who's out at the Marine Memorial Association in San Francisco, and I plagiarized a little bit of his numbers because I thought they were so meaningful. There were 2.7 million people who served our country in Vietnam. Almost 10% of those were casualties. In spite of what you read in the media and the impression they would like to convey, 97% of those military individuals were honorably discharged. The vast majority of them returned to a well-adjusted civilian life. Their employment rate was higher than the average population, and their drug usage was lower.